Right, I'm just going to start now.
Okay. So we're doing the second talk in our Olwg Insight series, Vision 2. Tony Griffiths is going to be presenting on reflections on energy change. Tony works as the technical director for Olwg. Has a broad global background in process engineering. He enjoys problem framing and collaborative working and being challenged to find simple solutions to complex problems. Tony's also a chartered chemical engineer and has recently completed an MSc with distinction in operational research from the University of Strathclyde. Okay, over to you, Tony.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Right, I'm going to switch my camera off and I'll just go to slides. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. So my plan for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about my personal reflection and observations on moving from, I guess, a fairly long career in traditional oil and gas developments and operations and processing into the clean energy space. And there's three key themes that I'd like to share and explore a little bit. And this is really specific to my own background and the work that I've been doing. So the first one is a lot of it's not much different, and I'll touch on some specific examples there of maybe where it is a little bit different. I'll talk about it's quite complicated, all of this, and again give some examples there. And I'll finish off by trying to summarise why I think that the role of engineers and the need for clarity has never been more urgent than it is at the moment. So I'll try and get that done within 15 minutes. We'll follow this up with a panel discussion, try and make some of the chats a little bit more interactive. And we've invited Alison Isherwood and Julia Shute to help that discussion. We'll introduce Alison and Julia later on, I think, when we get to that point. And then Simon, you'll hopefully moderate audience Q&A. So say when we get to that point, or even beforehand, I'd encourage audience members listening in, post your questions through the Q&A box, and then Simon will be able to pick these out later. We're going to try and make this a monthly event. So the previous one we did as an experiment, that was the one that Simon did. We got some quite nice feedback. The way that we're doing a panel discussion this time is in response to some of that feedback. And I think the next event we do, which we're targeting for mid-May, we're planning to give that an innovation theme, and we'll have some additional guest speakers there, the panelists. So I've put up a quote here. I started off with a quote. It's quite a famous one by Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, and he coined this, I think, towards the end of the Rogers Commission, which is the one set up to look at the Challenger disaster and why that happened. So he said that for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. So I always liked that quote. I always felt that was quite powerful. I guess when he said that, he was talking about deformation of O-rings and how certain materials actually behave in real life. But I think that quote is particularly applicable to climate change, as it is a nature-based system that is being changed. So I'm going to go through my material then for 15 minutes. So the first theme I'd like to cover is, I guess, some of my observations on how I'm seeing that some of the aspects and issues in clean energy technology and projects, they look quite familiar. So for me, with a background in oil and gas, chemical engineering, a lot of what people are talking about now in clean energy, a lot of it, yeah, looks very familiar. So I've got some examples here I'll go through. So carbon capture, you know, there's an awful lot of I think emphasis and work being done, and big studies being supported to look at carbon capture. I guess what I see in the low carbon kind of energy space, maybe there's a bit of a limited understanding of what some of these technologies are. I kind of get the feeling that some it's a little bit optimistic, but there are various CCS associations being set up. There's quite a few of these where they've got a lot of good information resources on the websites to help people interested understand, you know, what do these carbon capture technologies look at. That they are hugely expensive. You know, we often talk about, you know, what do you get for $1 billion, and I think in the context of carbon capture plants, I think the answer is not particularly that much. There does seem to be a talk of cost reduction within carbon capture, and I often wonder where that's going to come from. So on that aspect, what I recognise from oil and gas, so these amine-based solvent plants, these have been around for a long time. I've got a design handbook thing that talks about different amine systems and how to optimize them from the 1950s, so that, you know, I'm sure the plants predate that. It's not a new thing. These plants, they do require an awful lot of steel and energy to make the systems work, to pump all the solvent around and to regenerate it, and they're only partly efficient. So, you know, I know from having worked on these and designed and operated them that, yeah, they're quite good at removing CO2, but they also consume a lot of energy inside them, and they also don't remove all the CO2, so they're not 100% solution there. I think the next one that gets talked about is how to deal with the dynamic changes associated with demand and supply. So this is mainly for electricity. So the discussion goes that, you know, as solar and wind power is not entirely dispatchable, or it's not dispatchable, you know, the sun shines when it wants to, and the wind blows when it wants to. So how do you deal with that in terms of balancing a grid? And similarly to an extent with a gas grid, so in some locations biogas is being injected, has a slightly different composition, and that results in some operational challenges for the gas grid operators. I guess my observation is that, you know, again, a lot of this looks familiar. So in terms of the electric system, load shedding offshore is something that has to be dealt with. So if you've got, you know, numerous power generators rated at 25 megawatts each, and you've got lots of users rated at, you know, 5 to 6 megawatts each, and some of these trip or they switch off and things fall down, you know, the systems are designed to accommodate that. And I guess a little bit with onshore gas stations as well. So when you've got different blends of gas coming offshore, if certain offshore platforms fall down and the incoming blend changes, then the plant and the way it operates, particularly around dehydration systems and sweetening, they have to adjust accordingly. Other one I've got there is offshore structures, subsea structures, subsea controls. I think when we talk about offshore wind and tidal, there seems to be a really, you know, kind of feeling of excitement there that this is a new frontier for clean renewable power generation. I think when you look at some of the details, I think a lot of the vessels used, the walk to work methods, and a lot of the structures, how they're tied to the seabed. You know, again, a lot of these look quite familiar with what we've seen in the southern North Sea, kind of unmanned platforms, and some of the deep water structures. So I think a lot of this does seem to be adapted from oil and gas, and adapted for renewable purposes. It's probably simplified a little bit. On the topic of digitization and automation, you know, again, I think there's a big opportunity to make, especially where you have a dynamic nature of things changing throughout the course of a day. There's a lot of talk about cloud computing, which enables, you know, efficiency in working things out. You know, machine learning, AI capabilities, fancy analytics. A lot of this looks quite new. But I guess what I recognise from oil and gas is that even in the mid-90s, I remember a time when I kind of started work, and a lot of equipment sizing routines, you know, whole simulation of processes, and even the automation of equipment lists and weight lists, to help speed up the final answer, was already in place. You know, this was kind of commonplace back then. So yeah, again, I'm kind of wondering how new all of this is, and how do we learn from what we've achieved in the past. And the last one I've got here is in terms of life cycle costs and economics. There's lots of talk about levelized cost of electricity, for whether it's solar, wind power, or levelized cost of hydrogen. And that's exactly the same as what I'm used to from an oil and gas background, where we call it unit technical cost. So it's that division of your present value costs, both capital costs and operating, divided by the present value of your volumes. So it's exactly the same concept applied in a different way. Coming back to the question of what do you get for $1 billion? This is the cost of carbon capture plants. What this says is that where you've got fairly small plants, less than 1 million ton per year of CO2, then the cost of those is generally below $1 billion, so say $500 million. But as you scale them up, very quickly you get into really big plant sizes. So very quickly these plants go up to $2, $3, $4 billion. They're huge amounts of money, and it does raise the question, you know, if you've got that much money to solve problems, is this really the best use of that money? And I guess just to maybe prove a point here that some of these carbon capture plants, they're not entirely new. Here's a Google Maps view of, this is the Sage terminal at St Fergus. I worked here on site in the late 90s, and the picture actually shows part of the amine sweetening plant. So yeah, it's been there a long time. I think they were designed in the late 80s. They've been there since the 90s. Okay, so that's where I think they're not too much different. I've got a few examples of where I think it is actually different. So clean energy, my observation or belief is that I think a lot of these, they're not as complex technically. So in terms of a technical solution, a lot simpler. The picture I've got there, that's an example of where we've installed some solar PV on our rooftop. It's very simple. There's no moving parts. There's no requirement to test or maintain it. It just kind of sits there and generates power when it's sunny. I do think that where there is a big difference in complexity is, yeah, socially, politically, globally, the whole energy mix is much more complex that way. So it involves, I think, many more players and drivers. maybe as a result of that, that's why it feels a lot more collaborative, which I believe it is. I guess some of the fluids that we deal with in clean energy are a little bit different. So I've picked out the example of hydrogen here, where I came to realise or understand actually quite recently that as you drop the pressure of hydrogen, it actually warms up. It doesn't cool down. So those of us that work in oil and gas, will be used to the notion that as you flash natural gas across a valve or you drop the pressure, it gets cold, but actually hydrogen does the opposite. So the little chart there, that shows the Joule-Thomson coefficient below 0 for hydrogen. So it's a very unusual gas. It behaves differently in many different ways, and there's just one example there of how it's different. So I guess unless you've thought about this before or you've worked on it before, something that you may not appreciate. Yeah, and I kind of mentioned before that the renewables, they're not entirely dispatchable. So this picture here, this shows the power output from our rooftop solar, I think just yesterday, and it shows that even on a nice sunny day, when you'd expect it to be generating all day long, as soon as a cloud comes over, then the amount of power that it's generating drops to about 1/3 of what it was. So even clouds have a big impact. I guess the other thing that's different that I'm seeing as well, that there's a lot more nature-based solutions. I guess these can be regarded as a bit low-tech, a bit agricultural. They're still really tricky to make them work, but they're very interesting. We're seeing there's a big scope potentially for agricultural biogas, which can either be generated directly to power or injected into the gas grid. There's also talk about sequestration of CO2 from trees, from seaweed, etc. So this is another key area where it's different from traditional oil and gas. My point here that everything is quite complicated. I mean, I think those of us that worked in oil and gas anyway, we kind of understand that energy stuff is quite complicated. The picture I've got on the right, this is actually, it's a simplified program which BASE, they released last year. And the intent of it is to show that there's 15 different levers there. So these levers, they include things like transportation, buildings, so how we operate and build buildings, industry, low carbon electricity generation, and what we do with land and bioenergy. And it helps, I think it helps us to understand how all of these different levers together are required to get meaningful reduction in CO2. So if you do any of them in isolation, you might only get a very small reduction, but it does show the kind of interaction and complexity required. There's a useful tool there. So I found myself in the last few months having to relearn, I think, things that maybe I was trained up to learn many years ago and have since forgotten. So the whole discussion about heat versus work, which is related to the second law of thermodynamics, this is one example of heat is a kind of a low-grade form of energy. Work, which is either mechanical work or electricity, can be regarded as a higher grade. And if you convert one from the other, you can get more heat from work, but you won't get more work from heat. So that's a kind of an important point that I'd found myself having to go back to textbooks and relearn. And the other one for me is, I think, some of the basic equations for heat transfer and heat loss across conducting and insulating materials. Again, I found myself going back to textbooks to relearn. So yeah, fairly complicated things that once I knew and then I didn't, and I'm having to relearn. I've made the point here that although I described solar PV as simple, and it is quite simple, I think understanding the dynamic effects about, you know, when or how much power is generated and how that relates to our demand within the house is a little bit more complicated to understand. And I really felt that in order for me to really grasp this, I just had to install some panels and understand it. And I found that talking to my neighbours, you know, who don't have a technical background, they're struggling to understand even some basic concepts around, well, what's a kilowatt, what's a kilowatt hour, you know, what do all these numbers mean when I'm looking for a system. So it kind of makes you realise that, you know, although solar is definitely at the simpler scale of energy solutions, not everybody gets it, and it requires something there, I think, to be able to articulate these ideas for non-specialists. Yeah, unit conversions can still confuse. I'm not going to dwell on that. We did put out, I put out a blog post on that last week, and we've actually developed a unit converter app, which everybody's free to use. And then levelized costs. This can be quite complicated as well, purely because I think a number of the factors that make up a levelized cost are uncertain, and they may change throughout the life cycle of a project. So quite often you see these numbers banded around as being single numbers, but quite often that there's a pretty broad uncertainty on what that is. Okay, last slide then. The picture I've got there, you know, you can see there's a bunch of people on the left. They're kind of going over the cliff. They're following the simple answers but are wrong, and then there's a kind of a harder path where there's the correct answers, but they're just a bit more difficult or complex to grasp. And I thought this was a good picture, so it makes me think about how can we doing the work that we're doing, I guess, persuade people to take the correct path. You know, what does that involve? So this comes back to, I think, the role that engineers and scientists can fulfill at the moment and over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So we're definitely trained in robust evidence-based thinking. I think we're comfortable with complexity and some of these abstract ideas. I think generally adaptable to being in different work environments or different situations. I think we are ideally placed to examine different options without commercial political bias, because we tend not to be kind of political or commercial animals. You know, we tend to be scientists that like finding the right technical answer. But I do think that the challenge that we have as technical people perhaps is to find the right way to communicate insights in a way that they can be grasped and maybe influence people and developers and public bodies to follow the right path. And just some closing thoughts here then. So we've just seen over the last few days that the government's now committed to the 6th carbon budget, which, if I've got this right, requires 78% reduction in emissions by 2035, including aviation and shipping. And I think there's talk about that requiring an investment of up to £50 billion a year. So although it's a great ambition, I'm not really sure how that money is going to be spent, or, you know, do people agree that's going to be spent in the right way? So maybe there's an opportunity there. We've talked about this before. I think we've just run out of time to be relying on developing new things that may take a number of years to develop. You know, quite often these are kind of resource hungry. They require materials, and there's also a risk of market failure. So our shiny new technology is a bit of a distraction. Do we already have all the information and all the technologies that we need? Yeah, so that base tool that I mentioned, things like this, they can be really helpful to grasp the scale and complexity of the challenge. So, okay, I realise I've gone over a little bit with time. So that was my 15 minutes and a bit. I suggest we go to the panel discussion. Simon, do you want to take over?
Yep. Yeah, good. So I've got two people. We've got two additional people with us today. We've got Alison Isherwood and Julia Shute. Alison's got 20 years of global experience working as a reservoir engineer and technical leader in the oil and gas industry. She's worked for the big companies. She's worked with companies like Shell and Hess. Currently an independent consultant, but importantly, she's the London Net Zero Chair for the Society of Petroleum Engineers. She's got a Master of Engineering in Chemical Engineering from Nottingham University and has recently completed a postgraduate certificate in sustainable business with the University of Cambridge. Julia has got 12 years working as a petroleum reservoir engineer, first with Petro-Canada and then more recently Tullow Oil. She's got a BSc in Mathematics and Management Studies from UCL and an MSc in Computational Fluid Dynamics from Imperial University. So I think it would be good to ask both Julia and Alison to see if they've got any reflections. So Julia, if you can unmute.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks Tony for the introductory slides and really interesting listening. And I think from my perspective, sitting in oil and gas, and you can see from my background, I didn't study petroleum engineering or intend to go into oil and gas, but that's where I ended up. I actually, when I came out of university, first did try to look for jobs in renewables, but wasn't able to find anything. The paths were less obvious and ended up in oil and gas. I've always I always look to see what's going on. And I think now is a really interesting moment where the renewables are rising, it's in the news, the energy transition is taking off. But I think still for people like me, it's not totally clear how would you make a transition path across into the renewable sector. And I think listening to you now, Tony, I think it makes things a bit, in fact, make things a bit clearer for me. There are so many different paths you can take, and it'd involve a bit more. All of them would, nothing is directly transferable in terms of the engineering skills that you pick up in oil and gas, but there is, I'm sure, transferable skills, obviously with mathematical engineering backgrounds, that you can learn. But I think it's not knowing what direction to take, not knowing whether you need to go and study more or whether exactly what roles you could end up. I think the oil and gas industry, it's very established, it's very clear, you can look up anywhere exactly what different jobs entail. So I think from my perspective, I think probably lots of colleagues in a similar position, not sure exactly where to go. And I think the people who are managing to do it are the people, there's been a lot of redundancies recently in oil and gas, and are now taking that opportunity to either study or make some different turns. But yeah, I'm interested to hear other people's opinions, know what other people have done, and wonder where we can go so that we can work together as an energy industry and use some of the skills from people in oil and gas, which I'm sure there's some very relevant skill sets.
Okay. Fortunately, Alison is muted. I can't get her unmuted. She's dialed in by telephone. Alison, I think you might have to dial in again. So dial out and dial in again so we can bring you into the conversation.
Okay.
So Tony, what in terms of your journey, your transition into this, what's been your journey? I mean, why did you decide to move from conventional oil and gas into if you like, energy transition?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I always enjoyed doing what I was doing. So I always enjoyed doing, I think, a blend of technical work in engineering, but also looking at the broader, why are we doing this? Does it make sense? How does it fit with the other disciplines in economics? And so I always quite like the operations as well, and I like the development side. So I guess, well, I mean, I got made redundant last summer, and I saw that as an opportunity to, maybe reset the campus.
I don't know if you can hear me, Simon. I'm in.
We can hear you.
Oh yes, yeah, cool. All right. Maybe if I just finish my piece then.
Yeah.
So I thought, you know, I've got probably the best part of another 20 years left of my career doing something. Do I try and find another job doing the same as what I'm doing, or do I try and, you know, take the opportunity of I guess a break that was forced upon me to do something different? And you know, the more I heard about energy transition, climate change, the more I thought about, you know, if I still want to be employed, not just employed, but doing something that I really enjoy and believe in, you know, in 10, 15, 20 years time, I just have to get out of oil and gas. So, but again, you know, I wasn't really very clear at the time what that meant. So I got a feeling that my background and the skills and the things I've done were transferable, and I guess that's what I wanted to put to the test. You know, where are those avenues or parts of the clean energy space that I could add value, and this is what I've been doing for the last few months. But what I've observed, you know, we've been working on the Holyhead hydrogen job, and you know, talking to guys that been doing the tidal array up there. I think what strikes me is that a lot of people that are now quite well established in clean energy actually do come from an oil and gas background. So quite often project managers you see, health and safety people, business development people, quite often they've come from an oil and gas background, and maybe maybe they made the transition back in 2015 or so, where you know, originally the oil price dropped and the redundancies at that point. So you know, I think talking to these guys, they're quite inspiring in a way. So they're kind of saying, yeah, look, I made the transition, and you know, you do have to relearn a bunch of stuff. You know, you can't go in thinking that you know God's gift to whatever discipline you are. So there is an element of relearning, possibly restudying. I actually think probably less restudying and more, you know, more just getting experience on the ground. But no, there's definitely pathways there.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I'd like to change tack slightly with you, Alison, because I think you've done a certificate in sustainability. How does sustainability fit into this picture and what you've learned?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, I went into it because I decided to do the sustainability qualification because I really wanted a kind of deep understanding of the big picture and the kind of the whole complex system that is energy and climate change and sustainability. So I think I maybe jumped into it a little quick, because I think coming from being an engineer, it's actually quite different. Sustainability as a whole, I'd say, you know, it's a social science. You're really looking at the economics and the social impacts. But it's a really wide basis to look at this, not just in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but you know, biodiversity and social inequality, and all of these things are interlinked. But what I found is it's been fascinating, but it's also trying to now merge that with my experience as a technical engineer for the last 23 years. They're different skill sets, and it's trying to pull those together and try and kind of reinvent what I'm trying to do, what I want to do. And it is quite hard because, especially as a reservoir engineer, and Julia probably say the same thing, you're actually quite specialised. It's you know, the last 23 years for me has been about deep knowledge. The more specialised you are, the better it was for your CV. And you have this network of people which know you as a reservoir engineer, know your deep technical engineering, and then trying to, it's coming up a level. I actually think it's easier for more generalists to move across between, between the different energy sectors than it might be for someone who's got such background as a reservoir engineer. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Alison. Julie, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's interesting what Alison said, because she's obviously jumped in and chosen the sustainability course, and obviously I've looked at, there's many different courses and courses available on renewables and masters and short courses, but I think as a kind of specialized reservoir engineer, obviously that's not my background, and I'm sure I'm capable of learning other skills. It's which one to do, what would be the most applicable, where would be a good fit for somebody with my skill set within the energy transition and renewable energy businesses. I mean, I can see some things like project lifestyles and the economics I get quite involved in. I understand that quite well, but other parts which are probably less transferable, as Alison's mentioned, are quite specialised. The software we use and the exact problem we're trying to solve is quite different. And I think when I came out of university, oil and gas was easy because it was any company would take you with a science background, because there's so many courses available for them to train you on the job. Whereas looking at the renewables now, it's a minefield for somebody who's not an expert. And I think particularly with the last year of COVID, which hasn't given much space for most of us at home to kind of focus on ourselves, you kind of fall back into your comfort zone of doing what you know. And I think for me now, as we come out of it, what are the opportunities that are coming? There's a lot of, as Tony just mentioned, there's big commitments by the UK government. What's that going to involve? Is that going to be looking at the resourcing and the people available, and provide more obvious routes or supports for companies to train people up to do what needs doing? So I think that that's where I'm interested, and look for other people who maybe have more knowledge, or is there a niche of find something setting up so people can help people understand where their skill set fits?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting observations I can make as well. Is that there is a lot of talk about transition and helping people transition, but it's not obvious where that focus or help is. So I don't think you can find an organisation or a group that pointing people or connecting people with the industry. The other interesting observation is that it's quite, I think there might be a myth that there are lots and lots of jobs, and those jobs, they're struggling to find people, so people are running around trying to find people and retrain people, and it's a very competitive market. So there's a lot of self-interest and a lot of people that are trying to protect their corner of the business, because it is a large business and people want to retain that business. I don't know, Alison, if have you got, I mean, through your course, have you seen any or experienced what that market really looks like, or how people are trying to find people? Yeah,
so my course is very much across industry, so it wasn't focused on the energy industry, but as part of my course I did do my project was looking at how to connect oil and gas people to the future of energy. So I did quite a lot of review of just transitions, so historical just transitions. And as you say, you kind of mentioned, are the jobs out there at the moment? Well, not as many as people might think. There is usually a lag in just transitions, and certainly for something like carbon capture and storage, until there is real capital committed and these projects started, that will set the process for there being more jobs out there. But I mean, there are some initiatives going on to try and help people. A lot of them are behind the scenes and not particularly obvious to people. So like APITO have formed the Energy Skills Alliance with trade unions, trade bodies, but across the whole energy industry, including oil and gas and renewables. And they're doing a number of things, trying to look at forecasting skills, supply and demand across the energy industry to see where people really should be upskilling. And I think that part's really important, because you want to know that there might well still be more oil and gas jobs for geologists and reservoir engineers in 2050 than in carbon capture and storage, right? There's no real definition of this, and I think everyone's feeling like they should be moving away, and maybe they shouldn't. So that kind of skill supply and demand is important. But there are other things. The Green Jobs Task Force of the government, they're due a report out this month, which might have details. I know, at SPE, we're planning a skills panel session in June to invite people from universities of forming coalitions to look at this. So people are looking at it. I know of several different initiatives. I can't mention them all now, but it's not obvious to people. And I also think the recruitment process needs to change. There's a lot of talk about meta skills and critical analysis, that we have picked up through working complex oil and gas projects that are transferable. But when you look at jobs, they're still going to ask for years of experience or specific qualifications. So I think there's a lot of people see it's an issue, but I don't know. It's not clear to everyone where to get help right now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, certainly my experience of looking at the market was that. So the biggest two really are wind and solar, if you look at renewables, and most of those jobs are electrical engineers, generally looking for people who have specific experience in either wind projects or electrical engineering. There are apprenticeships, but obviously that's a different level of entry. And the other notable thing as well that I think you have to be prepared for is there's a very big difference in reward and remuneration in those industries. So I reckoned it was about a 50% differential between an equivalent electrical engineer in the oil and gas industry and an electrical engineer working in wind. And so, but there is this government talk about transferable skills, and there is trade body talk of professional body about transferable skills. But when you actually look at the jobs that are advertised, nobody's asking for transferable skills. Everybody's looking for somebody who managed a major electrical infrastructure project, or commercial aspects of getting land access rights to get high voltage lines in, or specific experience with wind. So that is that does look like a challenge. So I think there's a lot of political talk about it, but I don't necessarily see much action. No. And the question is how do you solve that?
Yeah, and I think sustainability as a whole, it's a more overarching subject. One of the reasons I did it, I didn't specifically want to go into renewable energy, or I wanted to look at that bigger picture. And I think some of the reporting and measurement, which is going to be really important to try and get to net zero, some of this scenario analysis that the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure and all of these reporting systems, I do think there are some transferable skills and analysis we do which could be transferred over. But again, it's not always obvious how to get into those jobs. They always want people who've had sustainability experience. And actually, I find most sustainability professionals I don't think come from a technical or engineering background, but I do think it would be useful to have some sustainability professionals who have that, have a mix, because it is a social science. Having some technical background, having some political or policy background, having some more HR type background, you need a variety of backgrounds in addressing that subject, I think.
Great, thanks for that. So I think that's we're just coming up for the end of this session, which is 45 minutes. We'll just check to see if we've got any questions. I don't think we've had any questions in. No, we've had no questions. So do you just want to final couple of concluding remarks from each of you? No more than 30 seconds. Tony?
Yeah, one thing I was going to say there, I think it's becoming a bit clearer to me as well that I think to be able to be in a position objectively to say why clean energy or renewables is good, I think you also need to understand what oil and gas is, or what that looks like. I think that's really important. So in terms of, whether it's carbon reduction or broader sustainability, I think unless I think unless you've got that deep knowledge of oil and gas, it's quite difficult to say why doing something different is better or how it's different. So that's something that I'm realizing. But I do believe that I think the skill sets we have will become more important over the next 5 to 10 years.
Great. Final word from you, Alison.
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think we need to have knowledge. You know, our knowledge from oil and gas is really helpful, and combining that with a wider understanding, you know, that technical understanding and some social understanding can really help. But I think in terms of transferability, I want to see us looking at things as an integrated energy industry. I think moving out of the silos, and maybe some of the big corporations that are varying their portfolio will help do that. But, you know, until we have that, I think transfer between the two is going to be difficult until they really need lots of people, and then maybe it'll just happen. You know, it's that supply and demand thing.
Yeah, well, yeah. I think there's a bit of truth in supply and demand, and I think it's almost impossible to know what the job market looks like at the moment, because the job market is completely distorted by COVID.
Yeah, indeed, that doesn't help.
Yeah. So, Julia.
No, just to say thank you. I think interesting discussion. I think particularly I talk about, is the demand yet? There's sort of a general feeling energy transition is happening. Right, we must all diversify. Maybe we're not quite there yet. You know, these projects, we're a bit ahead of when you need lots of people. So planning those paths now might be helpful, so that when more people are needed, it's sort of obvious where the skill sets can go and where people can transfer and where people actually are, you know, best left in the oil industry. So,
okay,
no, interesting. Thank you.
Great. Right.
Yeah, thanks.
So thank you everyone for joining. Smaller audience today, I think. The next session, we're going to delve into innovation and a bit more depth, and actually talk about what innovation really means. And we're hoping to have somebody come along from the Imperial College and the Grantham Institute to talk a little bit about innovation and perhaps what's going on in that space, and where innovation funding is actually coming from and how it's being used, because that's another potential area that people can explore. Okay, so thanks very much, and I'll call that to an end.
Okay, right. Thanks everybody. Thanks Julia, thanks Alison. Bye.
Bye.